in before our time's up.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. We are going to get started in just a few minutes to allow everyone time to log in.
Gabby, how many registrants did we have?
Around 150, I think. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. I will be passing the mic over to today's moderator, Shauna Narula.
Hello, everybody. I hope everyone is doing well. Welcome to our webinar today, Building Relationships with California Tribes and the Cultural Nuances of Tribal Communities. I'm going to be your moderator today for the webinar. And I just wanted to let you know that if you do have any questions, which we will be answering at the end of this, please direct them to the Q&A box, not the chat box. There are two different boxes for that. And the webinar is being live streamed on YouTube, and a link to the webinar recording, presentation slides, and useful resources will be provided via email after the webinar is finished. I'm going to actually turn my video on so you can all see me. So just kind of go over a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. This webinar is going to discuss building relationships with tribal nations to work towards the Tobacco Endgame Initiative. An overview of sovereign nations and how tribal governments work, the differences and similarities with city and county governments, and a lived experience of building relationships with tribes to move towards reducing the exposure of secondhand smoke on tribal lands in California. So I have the pleasure of introducing our two speakers for today. And first up, we have Calvin Hedrick, who is a Mountain Maidu and a project coordinator with the Tribal Community Coordinating Center. Calvin attended Humboldt State University, where he received his BA in Native American Studies, a minor degree in American Indian education. Calvin then attended the University of California, Los Angeles, pursuing his master's in arts degree in American Indian Studies. He has over 20 years of experience working with Native youth and communities in disease prevention and health promotion. He is a graduate of the Indian Teacher and Education Personnel Program at Humboldt State University and certified in the White Bison Native Wellness Institute and several other prevention curricula. He has also served as a Public Health Institute consultant to the NEOP American Indian Alaska Native campaign. He lives in the Sacramento area with his wife, 3 sons, and 2 nieces. So Calvin, please take it away.
Thank you very much. Hasasaga, Nikiyamka Calvin Hedrick, and as was previously mentioned, I am Mountain Maidu. And I work with TCCC, and I work with a lot of tribal communities. I've been doing work for different organizations with tribal communities for just over 20 years. And I'm going to today kind of I have some slides, but I'm also going to talk about some of the ways that some understanding that I have that I like to share with communities, especially communities who are non-tribal, on how to work with tribal communities. And I think that there's some things, definitely some tips, but I think also just understanding tribal communities, I think is something that I think a lot of times people really need to understand. So I'm going to share my slides now. So yes, working with tribal communities. Working with tribal communities, it basically means you're working with sovereign nations and or organizations benefiting American Indian people. Something to always remember is respect, is showing respect. Creating meaningful awareness of respect of one another and all things in tribal communities will definitely help build better relationships. And I know that a lot of times this is something that I think, is good generally working with any community, but really understanding what that means in tribal communities is going to be beneficial to anybody who is trying to work with a tribal community. Cultural beliefs and their impact. So how tribal communities communicate, the way how tribal communities communicate, and the way that we present ourselves, when and with whom we communicate, how we interact, and how we evaluate interactions can all be affected by our cultural beliefs. The way that we were raised, the way that we see the world, sometimes in tribal communities might be a little different, might look a little different than being raised in a non-tribal community. And so I think it's always beneficial to have some sort of an understanding of that, and to have an understanding that sometimes the way that we do business, the way that we interact can definitely be affected by things that are currently going on in our community and by things that have happened in our communities. So just remember, whenever you're working with a tribal community, the tribal communities are looking at you just like you're looking at them. When we walk into tribal communities, when we walk into a meeting, when we go into a tribal community, we have to have an understanding that as we're assessing our situation, as we're looking at the people that we're working with, looking at the people that are gathered there, the people that we're choosing to do business with in whatever way that we are, we also have to understand that they're looking at you in the same way. When people are coming into our community, we are definitely looking at you and assessing previous experiences, things that we've had experience with before are definitely going to influence the assessment. And I just kind of wanted to point out some things on this next slide. So when I talk about previous experiences, it's good to understand, especially in working with California communities, it's good to understand the previous experiences of California Indian people. So up here, I've got some pictures, and some of these pictures might make sense to you, some of them may not. From the first people who came to settle California, the missions were a relatively devastating period for American Indian people, in that much of our freedom was taken away. People were routinely taken to the missions and used in slavery to build missions, to work on farms. And so that from the get-go, from the first real settlement, we have an understanding that we're looked at as different human beings. And then moving into the Gold Rush period, where the Gold Rush period was, let's be frank here, the Gold Rush period was a period of extreme violence especially in Northern California. And it was the policy of the very first governor of the state of California to exterminate all American Indian people. So these are things that when I'm talking about previous experiences that you have to understand working in tribal communities, these are some of those previous experiences. You may have seen recently the discovery of a mass grave at a boarding school up in Canada, where 215 American Indian children's, the body of 215 American Indian children were found at a mass grave next to a boarding school. This is something that came as a shock to the world. To a lot of people who know something about boarding schools, of course, it was a shock to find a mass grave of that many young people. But it was something that we understood had been happening for a long time. Boarding schools were, boarding school period came after the gold rush and after missions. And the boarding school period was, again, it was very devastating because the idea of the boarding school, the policy was kill the Indian to save the man. So kill everything inside of us that is Indian to save the human being there, to assimilate them into Western society. And so there was a great deal of violence that happened toward these children. Um, a lot of emotional, physical abuse, sexual abuse, mental abuse, and spiritual abuse. And you could see by the picture on the lower right there, these three young men came in dressed to, in somewhat their native style, and their hair was cut and they were put into very military looking uniforms and forced to attend this boarding school. So this is some of the previous experience that we've had with people from outside. The loss of land, you can't really see it, but up in the upper left-hand corner in the 70s, there was the forced sterilization of, that's the 1970s, by the way, forced sterilization of American Indian women who didn't sometimes even know that they were being sterilized, that their ability to give birth was being taken from them. And so this is the experience that I'm talking about. This experience where during the gold rush in the upper right-hand side, you could see men just perched up on a hill in the morning as people were waking up in villages and just firing down into the village. So this is our experience. This is what we know is our past, and this is also what we know is has been the experience with working with outside communities. Now, I know sometimes we look at this and we say, "Oh, but Calvin, these things happened in the 17th or the 18th century and the 19th century." Sometimes even into the 20th century, but this is like experiences are different now. And in some ways, yes, but in some ways, no. The experiences are still very different. I have people from my tribal community who they refuse to allow individuals, professors, students from universities to come and ask questions because they know that that they're just being used for somebody's dissertation or for somebody's to help somebody with tenure, and the experience is not going to be benefiting the community. And so I really I can't say enough about this. Like we look at some of these things that look like they may be in the past, but these are things that continue and are continuing today. So it just some experiences that I want you to understand before you go into the community, because this is a community that's living with these things. And we think about things like boarding schools, some of the things that happened in those boarding schools, the trauma that was experienced. Speaking your language meant you would be beaten. Trying to pray when the sun came up, you could be beaten. And that trauma carried over well after boarding schools. So the trauma that was lived in those boarding schools became a part of the life of people after boarding schools, and then became a part of their children's lives and their grandchildren's lives. And today we're still living with a lot of the trauma, but most of us have never been to a boarding school and have never suffered that trauma. But because of this intergenerational trauma, a lot of these things continue in our community. So I definitely, I want to reach back to this point so that you can get somewhat of an idea. And I'm sure that some people do have somewhat of an idea, but I just kind of wanted to touch there to get started. So we tend to definitely see the world through our own cultural perceptions. The way that we look at the world, it can be very different given some of these experiences, given some of the ways that we're raised. The way that we're raised, that with a respect to elders, with in a lot of the communities that I work in, I know when I go in there and I'm working with young people, I have to be very, very specific, and I have to be come in a very good way. And, I'm a tribal person and I've worked in tribal communities for well over 20 years, but that's still a community that I may be going into that they don't know me there. And so I come in a very good way, and I come in with a very good understanding that I need to make sure that I am giving respect and I am understanding this community so that I can be accepted there. Let's talk about sovereignty. So a lot of times in our communities, we don't fully understand when we look at tribal communities what sovereignty is. So sovereignty is inherent rights for tribes to govern themselves. Sometimes people have asked me like where did, how come the federal government gave them this right? How come, why is that? Why do Indian people think that they're sovereign? Why do tribal communities think that they are sovereign? In the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, it states that the U.S. Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations, among several states, and with Indian tribes. And so from that point right there, there's an understanding that tribal communities are viewed by the federal government as sovereign nations. We have our own governments. We have our own health, education, housing, roads, public safety, much like a county or a state would have. And that varies from tribe to tribe, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. And this is also, we have an understanding that communities can have gaming in tribal communities on reservations because of the sovereign status. So basically, this is a case that challenged the sovereignty of American Indians, and basically, Chief Justice Marshall said that tribes possess a nationhood status and retain inherent powers of self-government. So this is what sovereignty is. Understanding and respecting sovereignty as rights not given to tribes, but maintained. The federal government did not grant sovereignty, it affirmed tribes their inherent rights to sovereignty. So when you enter into a into a tribal community, onto a reservation, when you pass that border, it's much like going from county to county or state to state. And this is the way we need to understand it and look at it. It is very different because we are a nation within a nation. And so we answer to the federal government as tribal communities, not to state governments. And so that's where this differs. And again, this is not something that this is something that has been maintained. It's something that's been affirmed, that sovereign status. So what does that mean? Well, that means basically that when you go into a tribal community and you see that there's gaming, but there's not gaming like in your county, and the county can't have gaming, that's because of our sovereign status. That's because tribes have the sovereignty that they can create their own rules, they can create their own laws, they can develop any sort of financial institution, they can have their own tribal police, in some cases, their own tribal courts, their own fire departments. And now this is true of a lot of tribal communities and a lot of tribes in the state of California, but it's not true of everyone. Some tribes may be smaller and they may not have the capacity to have a tribal law enforcement or have a tribal fire department. And that means they just have to have agreements with the counties or other local governments where they are, so that they can access those, like law enforcement, things like that. So basically, also what this means is if you're in say Humboldt County and the law enforcement needs to come and serve a warrant on tribal land, they need to first discuss that with the tribal police. And again, this is slightly different in every community, and sometimes even in those local municipalities, local law enforcement doesn't always fully understand what this means. But basically, this is, I mean, it's look at it as you would any other government, and give it that sort of respect and have that understanding. I wanted to talk about this because I know a lot of times when we're working with tribal communities, there's an understanding that there's a mass amount of wealth in tribal communities. Because we know if we live anywhere near a tribal casino, we've seen these tribal casinos. Some of them are, big and beautiful. The one down there in San Diego County on the top, that's Paula. The one on the bottom is Grayton, and that's up in Roanoke Park, California. So these places they're big, they're beautiful, and seemingly there is a lot of economic development, a lot of financial resources available to tribal communities. What I wanted to point out is in the state of California, there are 111 federally recognized tribes. Sometimes you'll see that number as 109, sometimes even lower, 108. But there are tribes within the state of California who are border bisected. So maybe part of their tribe is in Arizona and part of their tribe is in California, but they're only counted in Arizona, and this number reflects those all the federally recognized tribes and tribal land in California. So of those 111 federally recognized tribes, 66 operate casinos. So not every federally recognized tribe in the state has a casino. Sometimes some communities are just too small. Sometimes some communities are too remote. There are a lot of different reasons why. Sometimes tribal communities have been struggling for 10 or 15 years, but have just dealt with so much opposition from other communities, that other counties or cities. They've dealt with so much, you know, I don't know, fighting, that people don't want them in their community. So some tribes don't have casinos for that purpose. Now, of that 66 that operate casinos, about 46% of those casinos make a substantial amount of money. So we're looking at two here on the screen. Obviously, two casinos here that do make a good deal of money. That's not every casino. That's only just less than half who are big enough and wealthy enough to take care of their community. A lot of times, tribal casinos just make enough to maybe fund a few programs, keep their doors open. There are some communities that have very small casinos, and they're not making a lot of money, and maybe they're very remote, and not a lot of people go out to those smaller casinos. So I just wanted to mention that, because I know that there's an idea that in tribes that there's a great deal of wealth, and that's not true of every community. And you could definitely go any community that you live in California, you could probably go find a large casino, but then you can also probably go out to a tribal community where there is no casino, and there is definitely a need for economic development, and there's definitely a need for jobs and things to happen in those communities. Casinos are also not not the only source of revenue for tribes. Some have other sources. There are some tribes that have logging and logging in their communities. Some have other things that they do. So this is just a few. And again, my tribe doesn't have a casino, so I don't benefit from any of these casinos. A lot of tribes will, even if they don't have a casino, they will still get some funding from casinos that goes into a state pot. I will let you know that all of these casinos, every casino in the state of California, has been in some way, I'm going to say, forced into compacts with the state. And so a great deal of the money that comes into casinos will also go out and be paid to the state. And sometimes I've seen a lot of these tribal communities who spend a great deal on making sure that the community where they live, not just the tribal community, but the local community, maybe the county. There's some they make sure that there's these other entities are benefiting from their casinos. So you'll see sometimes where in some communities where the tribe will purchase fire trucks, or for the county, or even in some cases build new firehouses, buy the fire trucks, buy new police cruisers for the community. And that's just goodwill with the communities where they are. This is not true in every case, but you'll see that quite a bit. So again, getting back to just working in tribal communities, showing respect is very, very important. Understand that our elders are very important to us. If you ever go into a community where there's going to be a meal served, usually people will allow elders to go first, or even sometimes young people will get up and just get plates just for the elders. There's a great deal of respect there. And, you know, a lot of times our elders, you know, they come with a great deal of wisdom. I always say if you're working in a tribal community, and you're going to be doing anything you're going to be talking with elders, make sure that if you allot yourself 10 minutes, make sure that you add another 15 or 20 minutes, because tribal elders will, there's no yes or no answer. Sometimes it's yes, but it's a very, very long answer as to why they came to that yes response. So I know that with non-Indian colleagues of mine, when they've gone into do surveys in tribal communities, they, you know, definitely have to start setting up more time, because a lot of times elders will, you know, they'll want to tell you the story. And so that's a very respectful thing to do. So so make sure that you know to listen. There is a great deal of humor. Once you know people in tribal communities, you'll definitely understand that humor. And we've been through a lot. We've suffered through a lot of trauma. We continue to suffer through some trauma, but it's humor that keeps us going. And so there is a lot of laughter that happens in tribal communities. And you know, just be patient. Word choice, tone, body language. I think all of these things are important regardless of who you're working for, but being aware of those things when you're working in tribal communities is really very important. Basically, to gain respect, it's something that I've always said is you chop the wood and you haul the water. You do the things that need to be done. I've gone into a community and I showed up to do a presentation, and I was a little bit early, and there was a woman there and she was setting up chairs, and she just looked at me and she said, grab those chairs and start putting them around the table. So I started grabbing the chairs, I put them around the table, and I started moving tables around and making sure everything was set up. And then the woman that I had contact with came in and she said, oh, Calvin, you're already here. And I said, yeah. And she goes, okay, well, come up here and I'll get you set up so you can do your talk from up here. And the woman who told me to grab the chairs was very embarrassed, because she's like, oh, I didn't realize, like, I thought you were just here as a volunteer to help. But it wasn't anything for me to grab a chair and put it out and, you know, do those things that need to be done sometimes in communities by chopping the wood and hauling and carrying the water. Something that I've lived by for over 20 years. And I definitely think it's good advice when you're going into tribal communities. So how have you, or will you chop the wood and haul the water in a tribal community that you may be working in? That's just food for thought. I threw in this slide just to talk about tobacco, because tobacco in our community is it's very sacred. And so, you know, a knowledge that cultural or traditional tobacco should be viewed very differently than commercial tobacco. Tobacco is so important. You can see the baskets there on the left. Tribal communities in northwest coast of California, they would make these very beautiful baskets, and these were tobacco baskets that would hold the tobacco that people would use when they were going for ceremony, and when they were getting ready to go into a sweat lodge or something like that. So this is something that I think is really important to have that understanding. And when we work with our tribal communities, we always make the distinction that we're talking about traditional tobacco, and making sure that when we're talking about abuse, we're talking about commercial tobacco. And, you know, then also letting our tribal communities know, because sometimes in our tribal communities, we can't always get traditionally grown tobacco or wild tobacco, and sometimes there will be commercial tobacco that's being used in a sacred way. It's something that we're trying to work and make sure our communities know to try to use more traditional tobacco, but just have this understanding of the differences, that traditional tobacco is very sacred, and sometimes we might make mistakes of going into communities and saying something about the tobacco that is can be offensive. So make sure that you say that you're making that distinction between commercial and traditional tobacco. Before, when we were talking about some of the trauma that happened around missions, around the gold rush, around boarding schools, sometimes people will leave with an understanding that, oh, but that happened so long ago. And I put just some pictures on here of things that we deal with today. So up there in the upper left hand, the Kansas City Chiefs will scalp the Redskins, feed them whiskey, and send them back to the reservation. So this is racism, if you didn't recognize that. And this is racism around mascots. The disrespect of our elders, and the bottom left hand, the young woman with the red hand over her face is signifying that she's in support of recognition of missing and murdered Indigenous women. Native American women have the highest rates of unsolved disappearances and unsolved murders of anyone else. And in some communities, it is like the sheer numbers of young women who have disappeared or have been murdered, and there's been no investigation into those murders, is it's really very disheartening. And for the first time in the state of California, Assemblymember James Ramos has asked the state to recognize missing and murdered Indigenous women, understand what's going on. Also, up there we have water protectors. Some of you guys may have heard a few years ago in 2016 when the pipelines up in North Dakota, a lot of people went up there to to fight against them. This is something that we hold very sacred, is water. It's part of who we are, and so we make sure that we protect it. And different pipelines, the young woman there who's standing up to this is in Canada actually, with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, just one person with a feather standing up to them. And then on the upper right, during the last presidential administration, one tribe was disestablished, had their federal recognition stripped from them. So not all trauma is historical. Sometimes things are going on today. And this was a speech from quite a few years ago from a Maidu elder who said, we've been told to get over it. And maybe we can start getting over it when it stops, but it hasn't yet. So that's just a lot of these things that are going on continue to happen. I wanted to point out a couple of just real quick etiquette do's and don'ts. So learn how the community refers to itself. I get a lot of people asking the question, do you prefer Native American, American Indian? What do you prefer? You will hear me say sometimes I will say Indian. It's something that I'm used to because in our tribal communities, it's something that we say. A lot of times when I'm working, I try to say American Indian or Native American. I think this is really important. But it's also really important when you go into that community to find out how that community refers to itself. You might hear them say, we're Mountain Maidu. You might hear them say that we are, we're Yurok or we're Miwok. And so understanding that is really important, and just asking the question. Be honest and clear about where you roll it and your expectation are. Don't go into a tribal community and, try to pull the wool over somebody's eyes. Show respect, being very open to the ways of thinking and behaving and some of the things that you might see there. Listen and observe more than you speak. This is something that I do in every community that I go into. I try to listen a lot more than I speak. I'll be honest with you, sometimes I fail at that, but I think that it's something that I always have in my mind is to listen. Casual conversation is definitely important for establishing rapport. It's been my experience to make sure that people know who I am in these tribal communities. And this is some things I like to share. I also have some etiquette don'ts in here. So be careful telling stories about distant American Indian relatives in your genealogy as an attempt to establish rapport. There's something that happens a lot of times in our communities where somebody will come in and they'll say, oh, my great-great-grandmother was a Cherokee princess. We get this a lot. And this is something that we understand that a lot of people do have distant American Indian relatives, but if you're trying to do that to establish rapport, you have to understand that these are things that we live every day as being the people that we are. Somebody asked me recently, if a person came to you and said that they did not grow up Indian, they only found out that they were Native American when they were 18 or 19 or 20, and now they are trying to now they're saying that they know the Indian experience, that they've lived the Indian experience. And one of the things that I always say is my first recognition of who I was as an American Indian person. I had always known that growing up as a child, but I think it was around, I remember we had just moved into a house, and I was around 4 or 5, and we were watching a movie, and it was a Western. And I want to say it was John Wayne, but to be honest with you, I'm not sure. I just remember they said, "We've got to go get those savages." And I just remember thinking, that's me. I'm savages. And so when you grow up knowing that and having that as your earliest acknowledgement of being Native, um, it's something very different than understanding and being an adult and finding out that you're Native, or finding out that you had somebody in your genealogy that was Native. So sometimes that can be, it can be a little bit, it's been offensive. Sometimes it could just be a little bit naive. And so it's not something that I highly recommend doing. Again, this is kind of going back to controversial between Native American, American Indian. Again, find out what people prefer. Terms, phrases to avoid: let's powwow. I want to speak to the chief. I see 10 little Indians, but no chief. Squaw natives. Now, I'm sure that some of you guys are looking at these and thinking, oh yeah, I would never say that. And people don't even say that anymore. All of these things are things that have been said by human beings working in tribal communities in the last year. So my niece just came home and told me that she is in an EMT course, and somebody said, I see 10 little Indians, but no chief. And my niece said, I was really offended. And I'm like, and this is just in the last week. So when we think sometimes these things have gone away, they definitely haven't. So there are just a few etiquette do's and don'ts. I definitely want to make sure that, I know I've kind of gone over this kind of quickly, but I just wanted to sort of give a brief overview, and I'll definitely, any questions that you might have of anything that we've said after the next presentation, we'll have a Q&A period, and I'll be able to answer those questions. But one thing that I did want to say going away, a lot of times I talk a lot about trauma in our community, but something that that we're also very proud. We're very proud of people like Jim Thorpe, who was the greatest athlete of the last century, called that by Sports Illustrated, for his being a professional football and baseball player, and being an Olympic gold medalist. We're very proud of Billy Mills, who won the 10,000 meter gold medal in the Olympics in Tokyo in 1960. We're proud of Ira Hayes, who, if you've ever seen this picture of the soldiers raising the flag above Iwo Jima, there was a Native American person, Ira Hayes, who was a part of that. These are heroes that are always been a part of my life. And then, of course, Secretary Deb Haaland, Secretary of the Interior, just named that. Also one of my classmates at UCLA. I'm very proud of her and the position that she's in. Assemblymember Ramos there, up on the upper left next to Deb Haaland. And then just also, that we continue to dance. We are graduating more American Indian people from college than ever. And then down in that bottom picture there is just, we're very proud of Kyrie Irving, who is an individual who is Native American, plays in the NBA, and has really taken his finding out, at a later age, that he was Native American. And he, has really kind of put himself in a place where he takes care of the community. And there you can see him when the NBA was playing in the bubble, he has sage that he's saging the arena with. So I just also wanted to point out a couple of heroes in our community too, that it's not all trauma. So I know I'm at my time there now, so I will pass it on to Narinder, and I'll see you guys for questions.
Okay, so now I'm going to introduce Narinder Thaliwal, who is going to be our next speaker for today. Narinder Thaliwal is the Director of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Other Drugs at ETR, and the Project Director of California's Clean Air Project, a project funded by the California Department of Public Health that provides technical assistance, training, and educational materials related to the issue of secondhand smoke in tribal casinos and tribal lands throughout California. Ms. Thaliwal has established strong working relationships with tobacco control programs in many of California's counties and sovereign nations. Narinder also oversees the Tribal Communities Coordinating Center and is co-director for the Tobacco Education Clearinghouse of California project. She is the recipient of the 2009 Carol M. Russell Award for Leadership and Vision in Tobacco Control and the 2009 Roger Kunde Award for Outstanding Service and Commitment to Youth. Narinder holds a bachelor's degree in social sciences and a master's degree in gerontology from Warwick University. She has worked in the health education field for the past 24 years, with the last 16 in the tobacco control field. So now please take it away, Narinder.
Thank you so much. Calvin, thank you for that wonderful presentation that really sets the stage for my presentation of relational components that we have worked in within CCAP. And so next slide, please. I wanted to start off with our mission. ETR's mission, that is to improve health and increase opportunities for youth, families, and communities. ETR envisions a world where all people have the information, skills, and opportunities to lead healthy lives. We are driven by our mission to improve health and increase opportunities for youth, families, and communities. ETR embraces the purposeful inclusion of all people as a means to honor and respect difference and to elevate the strengths brought by diversity of experience, perspective, and expertise. Next slide, please. So you might be wondering why I shared ETR's vision and our statement, and I'll get into that after this slide. But ETR CCAP was funded to work on reducing the effects of secondhand smoke, a statewide project. One of our objectives, and you'll know I'm saying one, at that time was that by 2008, 8 tribal casinos will have adopted and implemented a smoke-free gaming facility. We're now in 2021, and we know that we still don't have it. So we know that this is a long process, a process of building meaningful relationships and respectfully moving our work forward. And so throughout this presentation, you'll see the steps that we took to move our work forward. We were technical assistance providers working on multiple areas, including smoke-free multi-unit housing and outdoor areas. And that was not just on tribal lands, but for the entire state. Next slide, please. I wanted to share, which ties into our mission statement, a mission statement that I'll show on the next slide from Redding Rancheria. Redding Rancheria is comprised of Pit River, Yana, and Wintu. Those are the people of Redding Rancheria. Next slide, please. So you can see on this slide the vision statement of Redding Rancheria Tribe. It lies in honoring our elders, building healthy families, and promoting self-reliance in all of their members. They invest in their youth and adults, knowing that they will create the future with the strength of their ancestors. They empower them with knowledge and skills for a changing world. And so when thinking of the vision statements of all of the tribal entities that I have interacted with, it resonates with the vision statement of Redding, as far as Redding Rancheria, as far as strengthening their capacity and their youth and building on the knowledge of their elders to help guide them as they maneuver through the world. Next slide, please. So for us, one of the things we quickly learned when working in California's Clean Air Project with the guidance of many tribal individuals and tribal projects such as SINICA, such as Nevada Cal Indian Housing Association, that it's a top-down approach versus grassroots advocacy. Networking and partnerships and persistence are integral and follow through. And so an example, and I know Calvin gave an example of showing up at a meeting and helping set up tables. And for us, I remember getting on a flight to meet with a tribal chairman in San Diego. And I got off my flight and then got a text message to say that tribal chairman had been called away to an unexpected meeting. And feel free to come and visit, but you won't be able to meet with tribal chairman. So I made the trip out just toured the casino, walked around, didn't really even interact with anybody, and then had another meeting for another project and was able to catch my flight back. Now, one perspective might be that that was a wasted trip. And another perspective, and the one that I had, was that it was absolutely not a wasted trip. I had already flown out. I had conducted a tour of the casino and of some of the other components within that tribal lands, and was able to have another meeting with another tribal representative of another tribal casino. And so it wasn't a wasted trip. And the other thing is that, you know, that piece of where you're being tested, and Calvin talked to this earlier, is that you're being seen as, are you going to show up? Are you going to put in the work and the effort that's needed? And if you are, it goes a long way. So chairman that I was not able to meet with rescheduled the meeting knowing that I'd made the trip out for the following week. And so we were able to actually meet in person. But it's just knowing and being and understanding that we have, these are steps that are needed for us to be persistent and committing to the work that we would like to do. Originally, again, as I said, funded to work on all aspects of secondhand smoke exposure. But then in 2010, with funding decreasing, our focus became solely on continuing our work with tribal nations for smoke-free gaming and expanding our work to include tribal housing and recreational areas. Next slide, please. So on this slide, you'll see successful relationships and then successful outcomes. So while our work began with Reading Manchuria and Wind River Casino, we now are in a place collaboratively working with 7 tribal casinos that would like to collect data to remain smoke-free after having implemented a smoke-free indoor gaming facility during COVID. Prior to COVID, we had 3 completely smoke-free casinos, all of which were on the smaller scale with less than 350 gaming machines, and in some cases, 76 on 76, which is La Jolla's casino that they opened close to their campground, completely non-smoking. So you can see the sizes vary significantly. We now have tribal gaming facilities with 2,000 plus gaming machines interested in remaining smoke-free. So while COVID has impacted all of our lives and businesses in many ways, it has also heightened the awareness of clean indoor air and the reduction of not only secondhand smoke, but also third-hand smoke. Next slide, please. Gabby, if you could play the video, I think the video speaks for itself.
I believe all reservations or rancherias have an extreme problems with drugs, alcohol, smoking, whatever they smoke, you know. So what we try to do is, and we designed this particular unit to be for the younger generation. This is our opportunity to begin smoke-free, to help our community. This last project that we decided to do was just a small photoplex, but with this photoplex, we wanted to do it specifically for our young people to go into a unit and smell smoke. It just gets into everything. So we thought, you know what, we're building our funding. We can create the policies, we can create the atmosphere that we want for those units. When the board went to choose and pick based on qualifications, who was going to receive those apartment complexes, they knew at that point that they were a smoke-free environment. They knew that Surha would be monitoring them yearly or every 6 months. And for young kids in this generation, I thought it was a very positive experience knowing that we had tribal members who are willing to abide by this rules, smoke-free zone.
You know, back in the 60s, 50s and 60s, it was cool to Today it's not so cool. Today we're known what happens with secondhand smoking, just smoking period. Not only with cigarettes, but with drugs and everything else. So the awareness that is brought, I think, makes a huge difference. Any new development from this point forward, which they're planning quite a bit, is going to be smoke-free. It sets the example for other drugs and other House of authorities to take the bold step, because it is a big step.
Going by the complex itself, very clean. Don't see anyone smoking outside. It is a great opportunity for our young tribal members, as well as they're setting the example for other young tribal members, knowing that they can live in an environment that's smoke-free. We have a smoking area for those that have to smoke, but it's a fair distance from where the complex is. And they've been in there in the units about a year. We just did our first complete inspection of the unit. It's important for all members of the tribe to be able to utilize our tribal facilities, our homes, our apartments. But so far we have succeeded, and I think we can move along and show the people, we have a complex, 4-unit complex, but we don't allow smoking pets or whatever. And it's workable. We haven't, like I said, I haven't heard any negative about it. Advice to other tribes is that, I think it's important that you look at the harm that cigarette smoking can do. Secondhand smoke does not bother me, but it bothers a lot of other people. And we gotta just because we don't mind it doesn't mean that everybody doesn't mind it.
Just the effects that it has on kids and the long-term effects that I never realized. Heck, I have grandkids, but it's having grandkids. I've never smoked in the house with them. I've never smoked in the vehicle with them. I'm not talking about my kids, my grandkids. And knowing that, it took education for me to understand that. Thank goodness for California Clean Air Project, because that actually is what opened my eyes quite a bit.
Make our air cleaner. Let's do whatever we can do. It may be slow. We have to do it in increments, but it's doable.
Thank you, Gabby. Next slide, please. Sorry, I didn't realize I was on mute. So with the passing of Prop 56 came the strategic opportunity for California Tobacco Control Program to fund tribes directly, to be able to work within and on their tribal lands and communities to reduce the harmful effects of commercial tobacco. And you'll see on this slide why is engagement needed on the broader perspective. As we were continuing our work within CCAP, the health perspectives and the use and the uptake on electronic devices became very clear and evident that this is an area that not only is impacting the United States, but is impacting sovereign nations and the youth within sovereign nations and that live on the tribal lands and outside of the tribal lands. Next slide, please. In 2017, SNIGA implemented the opportunity for associate members to present to tribal members the day before the actual SNIGA meeting. So, and that's the same day that their executive board meets. The initial presentation was made at a SNIGA associate member pre-meeting opportunity via CCAP. On June 17th, April Waisler, the chief of the California Tobacco Control Program, asked for input from the tribal members that were present at the meeting and feedback on the initiative. And CCAP was able to secure 6 tribal locations to conduct the tribal consultation meetings throughout the state as shown here. The actual sites were Black Oak Casino in Tuolumne, Wind River Casino in Redding, Chukchansi Casino, Picayune, Morongo Casino, Hamor Casino, and the Northern Circle Indian Housing Authority in Ukiah. And these were conducted on tribal lands at the request and feedback from the tribal individuals that were at this initial meeting that April presented at, to say if you want to hold these tribal consultation meetings, you need to hold them on tribal lands, and you need to be present so that we can be part of the process of hosting you as well. Next slide, please. One of the things when presenting this initiative was clearly defined that CTCP was talking about commercial tobacco, not sacred, traditional, or ceremonial use of tobacco. So that was very clearly stated in the presentation. Next slide, please. So the initiative goals were to build capacity and skills among tribal members and staff employed by tribal governmental organizations to implement tobacco use prevention and reduction interventions and provide health education services, to mobilize and engage community residents and tribal government organizations to support tobacco use prevention and reduction policy and system changes. Again, when I say tobacco, I mean commercial tobacco. And then implement, support, and evaluate tribal project policy and system change campaigns that seek to prevent and reduce tobacco use. Next slide, please. So in the past 15 years of being funded for CCAP, we went from being the only project statewide that was funded directly to work with tribal nations around exposure to secondhand smoke on their tribal lands, originally specifically for the casinos, but then again expanding our work to other areas, as you can see, from housing to outdoor recreational areas, and then still including the tribal casinos. So, and you'll see the American Indian Initiative timeline that CTCP have shared, and that now we have 18 projects funded, comprising of 13 individual tribal projects and 5 consortium projects, continuing our collective work towards the endgame initiative. What is so wonderful to see is now, with 13 tribes being directly funded to work on commercial tobacco, there is a chance to begin working grassroots for education and engagement alongside the top-down approach with respect to tribal governance. So alongside the projects working within this initiative, we also have projects that have chosen to work on tribal smoke-free casinos. These are Communities Against Nicotine, CAN, Communities Energized for Health, CEH, and the Tobacco-Free North Coast Project, bringing the total number of projects actively making inroads to working with tribal nations to 21. These are even more strengthened with the partnering with their LLAs and their local, regional, and statewide coalition meetings. Next slide, please. I would like to thank CTCP for their continued commitment, support, perseverance, and vision that has enabled us to be where we are at today and can continue our work towards the tobacco endgame, and to ASH Project for hosting this webinar. And on this last slide, you can see the associate memberships that CCAP has that has enabled us to make inroads, to build meaningful relationships and continue those relationships to this day and moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Narinder, for that wonderful presentation. So before we actually get into the Q&A, I just want to highlight some exciting news on the ASH front. We have just launched a new podcast called Real Talk Tobacco. I'm actually the host of that. And the trailer is now out. You can listen on Spotify, Google, and soon you'll be able to listen on Apple. And you can also visit our website for the podcast, which Gabby's going to be putting in the chat box. And then you can access that and then click on whatever podcast platform that you prefer to listen to. And the trailer is out now, so please go check it out and share that with your colleagues and your friends that are interested. We're also going to be launching our new Advancing Momentum for a Tobacco-Free California page on our website very soon. So within the ASH website, it's going to be a designated page that just focuses on the Tobacco-Free California work that we are doing, that our grant is about. So please stay tuned for that. We'll be sending out a message or posting on our social media about that very soon when it goes live. And just a reminder, I know a few of you have asked about this, but all the slides and the resources, including the video and the podcast link and everything, will be shared with all of you after the webinar is over. And this was being live streamed on YouTube, so you can also go check it out on the ASH YouTube channel, which is ASH.org USA, and you can go watch that over again and share that with other folks. So now I'm going to be going to the Q&A chat box to field some questions for our panelists. The first question that we have is, how can we get internal colonialism out from tobacco control policy and also confront big tobacco in endgame? How do we stop tokenizing land acknowledgements and make them authentic? I'm gonna post this in the chat box so that you can refer back to it. Calvin, why don't you take a stab at that first?
Okay, I'll take a stab at this. I think honestly a big thing is I know that this may not be the answer that everybody's looking for, but I really do believe that it's education, and it's not just it's not always just up to the tribes to be the ones to sort of adapt to like policy change. It's also I think sometimes like other programs, non-tribal programs who are working with tribal communities, to have an understanding that changing a tobacco control policy in a tribal community means that you're infringing on the sovereign rights of that tribe. And I think that sometimes people don't take that into consideration, that if there's a tobacco control policy that is saying that any sort of policy, it means that a tribe is sort of giving up part of their sovereignty in some cases. And so I think that that's something that people really have to understand before the ask even happens. And so I think that that's something that I think would be really I think it's really important to understand. And really it's like educating people on on the idea that, like I was talking about before, the tobacco is something that's very sacred to us, but it doesn't, in our communities, we also, to be fully transparent, in our tribal communities, we also need to have an understanding that we need to go out and harvest traditional tobacco and use it in a very traditional way, rather than going to Walmart and buying tobacco to use in that same traditional way. But at the same time, we have to, there has to be an understanding that working in tribal communities is very different, and the sovereign status of a tribe needs to be considered whenever we're working with a tribe and whenever we're asking for tobacco control policy. And then tokenizing land acknowledgements, I agree. I think that I always appreciate a land acknowledgement. I do always appreciate when, and I hope that I'm answering this question correctly. I do appreciate whenever a non-native agency or conference or something like that does a land acknowledgement. I do appreciate that. But even more than that, like more than just like looking up and saying, oh, I'm on Nisenan land today, but understanding who Nisenan people are, understanding like the battles that they are going through, that they've gone through, who they are, where they are, look past the fact that maybe they have gaming, look at some of the other things that are going on in those communities. And I think that is, hopefully that is sort of an answer to, not just a land acknowledgement, but actually going that sort of step further. And I don't know if I answered your question fully, Jose, but hopefully that's it.
Narinder, do you have anything else to add to that question?
The only thing I would like to add is the recognition of the projects, the tribal projects that have been funded directly, that are looking at working towards policy on their tribal lands. And those range from smoke-free housing to smoke-free outdoor recreational areas on the tribal lands, and even as far as smoke-free casinos, and then also adopting and implementing their own tobacco tax on the sales of commercial tobacco. And so it is really exciting and wonderful to see that and partner working with the tribes that are funded, but also to see the change that is actually happening. And I think one of the things that Kelvin talked about as well, as far as adoption and implementing policy, is what does policy look like on each tribal land? Because we can't blanketly say each tribe's policy is going to be a written policy even. Is it going to be a policy that's adopted within their minutes? Is it just a verbal policy? So just that recognition of that, working with one tribal nation means that you've worked with one tribal nation, and you can't say that working with another tribal nation is going to be along the same steps, and just keeping that in mind. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for those answers. We have the next question. I'm gonna type that right over here in the chat box again. What is the best way to start the conversation about policies dealing with commercial tobacco policies? Example, tobacco retailer licensing when commercial tobacco is a big economic factor. Maybe Narinder, you want to take that one?
Sure, I think that it's a very valid point, and it is a big economic factor for many tribes, especially the smaller tribes in the more rural areas that do have smoke shops. And so one of the things that we want to keep in mind is that first and foremost for us, at least with California's Clean Air Project, we do not impede on the sales of tobacco for the tribes. Our purpose is to work with the tribes, especially with the tribal casinos, to moving towards implementing and adopting a smoke-free indoor air policy, clean indoor air policy for their tribes, entities. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, there are a few of the projects that have taken on implementing their own excise tax onto the sales. So this funding, while the tribes and projects like ours are funded to work towards a movement of eliminating exposure to second and third hand smoke, it is not our prerogative or our stance to be pushing the commercial tobacco retail licensing onto the tribal projects. Now, we can discuss it, but we certainly don't, at least for CCAP's perspective, do not go down that route, if that makes sense. Kelvin, I don't know if you wanted to add to that. I just, yeah.
No, I think I definitely think that's good. And I think that some of the things that we covered today can kind of also, have that understanding and help with that. But no, I think that was good.
Great, thank you. Next question, are there resources for Native American parents who are struggling with their kids' addiction to commercial tobacco that we can share on parentsagainst.vaping.org website? Which one of you wants to go? Go ahead, Calvin.
I'll answer. This is a good question. I do, in other work that I do, I work a lot with Native American youth, and I really appreciate at TCCC the some of the materials that we're coming out with. We have a couple of new fact cards that are coming out soon that really talk about, really give some good information about like vaping and about that kind of commercial tobacco. I think that a lot of times anything that really points out that, dispels some of the myths and some of the rumors, a lot of the youth that I work with come back and tell me things like, oh, well, this isn't, vaping is like, it's harmless. Vaping is, there's no tobacco. I mean, there's there's no nicotine. There's a lot of misinformation that's out there. And I think anything that you have that any materials or anything that you have that youth can look at and see, and it resonates with them, but also that it has a lot of these facts. So for instance, the materials that we're coming out with have, like Native American young people on them, and just some really good information. And I think that that's important. I know that with the young people that I work with, they have seen some of these fact cards, and it's sort of a very eye-opening understanding that when we're looking at fact cards that have a lot of this information, it's very different than some of the misinformation that they're getting. And I think that can kind of work. But yeah, I think that that's something that TCCC will have out, where it's going through the testing right now. So it should be available soon.
Great. That's a wonderful resource for everyone to be able to access. Narinder, you have anything else to add?
I think if folks visit CCAP's website, there are some video collections on there from tribal youth that talk about vaping and how vaping impacts their lives, and how those components are being made available, and how they have access to them. And then there are also some infographics that were put together after some conferences that CCAP was able to attend and participate in, where we conducted interviews of tribal youth to get their perspectives on vaping and access to tobacco products. So they should be available on CCAP's website. And I can put their website in the chat.
Great. Yeah. And I think we'll be able to send out that link as well with all the rest of the resources once we're done here, and we send that to everyone via email. Okay, we have another question. Here we go. What is the relationship between rancherias and reservations? Are there any special considerations when working with rancherias?
Good question. It's sort of funny, but I took my slides on reservations and rancherias out for this presentation for time, and I knew as soon as I did it that somebody would say, somebody would ask this question. This is a question that I love to answer, mostly because I did a lot of my graduate studies work in this area, and so it's always good to use like what I spent so much money on, this information that I learned. So basically, how deep do I want to go here? So reservations and rancherias today are basically the same thing. So rancheria, a reservation is set up either by a treaty or by a presidential proclamation. There are several ways that reservations were set up. Basically, they were set up as obviously as sovereign nations that we spoke about before. The problem was in the state of California, when they came to negotiate treaties in California, the federal government negotiated these treaties, had tribal people move off of their traditional homeland onto what was to become a reservation. The problem was at that time, the gold rush was happening in California. A lot of people were coming in California, and a lot of these reservations that had been set up were set up in very valuable parts of California, some of them on the coast, some of them through Central California, which if you've ever driven through Central California or you live in that area, you know it's the area that feeds most of the country. And so farmers were like, you can't give away all of this land to Native people. And so those treaties that had been negotiated were never ratified. The problem was that people didn't come back, the government didn't come back and tell the tribal people who had left their traditional homeland. So what happened several years later, about 20 years later, was this recognition that there were what they called homeless Indians in California who had no reservation, and the land that they had moved to was now being sold to farmers and pioneers coming out to California. And so what they did was they went, the federal government went and they decided that they were going to just buy small plots of land for Native people to move to. And they would buy these rancherias in California, and any Native person could then go and live on those rancherias and be taken care of. So they weren't set up in the same way as a reservation. But what happened is over time, those reservations or those rancherias grew and people prospered and they lived there. And so they found that they wanted to have some of the same some of the same rights that reservations had. And so today, when we look at rancherias, they're very much, they're sovereign nations. They will sometimes be described as smaller reservations. That's not what they are. They just have a different name. Rancherias are only found in California because of that, the homeless Indians issue. And so reservations and rancherias are basically today very much the same. Whew, I did that quickly.
Thank you. I think that was a pretty good overview of that. Okay, so we have another question. How big of an issue is tobacco use in tribal communities? How about we go with Narinder next?
So in thinking about working with tribal communities, commercial tobacco use is very high. And it's one of the highest percentages of use within the number of individuals within the population within California. So, and I'm speaking for California. The rates of smoking are above 30%, 29 to 30%. Youth smoking is on an uptake, and I don't have that right in front of me. I apologize, but again, you can find it on CCAP's website, more information. But it is commercial tobacco use is a problem, and secondhand smoke exposure is a problem on tribal lands. And when I say it's a problem, I mean it from the best way of saying that. Tribal nations themselves recognize that, and in particularly the tribes that are funded and the consortiums that are funded to work through CTCP funding for reducing and eliminating use and exposure to secondhand smoke of commercial tobacco. They're actually actively working on this because of the high use of tobacco and the impact that is having on the health and the accessibility for youth within their tribal communities. The projects that are funded are all establishing some already have established tribal youth coalitions, but others are establishing and bringing together tribal youth coalitions that are not just working on tobacco, but on the holistic approach of health and other factors of building their capacity, their youth's capacity to be able to take that messaging and work with their tribal elders and their tribal community to get more education and information out, which Calvin has mentioned before, is a way for us to start making inroads to address this issue of tobacco use, on commercial tobacco use in tribal communities. And Calvin, I didn't know if you wanted to add anything else.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it is an issue. It's something that I'm very happy that tribes are getting funding to do this work, because I know that it is an issue in our tribal communities. I know that when I'm out working in tribal communities, I live in Sacramento, when I go home or when I go out to other tribal communities where I'm working, it is an issue. I know that when I would go out even 10 years ago, we were making such strides that I saw very, very few young people, very few who were smoking. But to big tobacco, to their credit, they did a lot to try to get back into the game with young people. And I've got all these young people who now are like using it, vaping, and using different things, and it is a problem. And it's something that we definitely need to continue working on. It's something that hopefully some of our projects through TCCC, some of the projects that have been given the funding, the state funding, are starting to take and look very specifically at their community, instead of making it like a national program that's going after it, but more just the actual community looking at their community to try to find ways to eliminate smoking in their own community, I think is going to be really beneficial.
Definitely. Okay, we have two really great questions. I think Hopefully this will be the last two, but if anyone else has any other questions, please type them in quickly before we have to end. So this is from someone who is actually looking for data as they're located in Florida. Are there any reputable data sites you would use or would recommend to gather tribal community data? I noticed an American Indian Population and Labor Force report was referenced. So this person is located in Florida and would like to use similar strategies and information to help educate local tribal communities in their area. Did your organizations gather your own local CA data, focus group surveys to determine priority areas of need? Calvin, you want to go for that one?
Well, sure. I could answer sort of just shortly, but I definitely have seen some really good. I'm sorry, I don't, and maybe Narinder does, but I don't have a lot of sites just right off the top of my head. But there are some really great resources out there, and I know that in looking at building some resources for our tribal communities out here, I look and I say a lot of other communities have some really great resources. I think. Just recently, some of the work, I think it's, I don't know, maybe Narinder can help me here. I think it's Michigan that has some really, really good resources, very specific to tribal communities. We've actually used some things from the Northwest Portland Area Indian Health Board, some of their things, but they're definitely out there. And I think that, it just unfortunately takes, I could probably try to find some of those places that I've gone to before and send them. But yeah, I think that there are some really good resources, and maybe Narinder has more specific.
I think what is challenging for data specific to tribal communities is, what does that mean, and how is that data collected? I know in California we are, and TCC, Calvin's part of this, we are looking at how surveys are conducted, how people identify themselves when surveys are conducted, and what types of questions are on those. And the surveys that have already been conducted don't necessarily capture all representation from tribal nations within California. So I know there are some other sites that I can look into as well. I know Calvin's going to look into them to be able to share. Shauna, that you can then provide for the attendees. And I'm sorry, but it's just it can be quite challenging, because the data is how representational is that of the community that we are wanting to work with. And so there is movement to strengthen and better the data collection, and so we're looking forward to that.
Great, yeah. So after Narinder and Calvin can kind of gather some of their data sources, and then we can definitely share it with you afterwards when we send the email out to everybody. So we have another question over here from Colorado. Are there barriers in California providing state funding to tribal communities? Does it require any IGA of any sort? Narinder, you want to go for that?
Sure. So when the funding came out that California Department of Public Health, California Tobacco Control Program were putting out, it was a governor's requirement for having the consultation meetings of any state entity that wants to put out funding. So CTCP followed that letter, did their due diligence. And the one specific piece that is in there is that they can only fund tribes that are federally recognized. So even tribes that have state recognition are not eligible for the funding. And that is one of the stipulations of the funding that came out.
Great. Calvin, you have anything else to add?
Sorry, no, I think that's good. I am very happy that here in the state of California that there is state funding for these tribal communities. I think that the money is going to be really great for a lot of the projects that they have and that they're working on in these tribal communities. So yeah.
So if there's no other questions, we have like 3 minutes left. I'm just gonna stall for a couple seconds. If anybody wants to type in any last minute questions. We did have a comment talking about Kyrie Irving, that she didn't know that he was Native American, if he could try to be a spokesperson or speak up a little bit more on behalf of the community. It's just a food for thought with that question, or comment rather.
I love that idea. I love that idea of like Kyrie coming in and helping us to be a spokesperson. I mean, an athlete who is, you know, has that background, but then also he's really embraced his Native American heritage. That would be awesome.
Yeah, for sure. I think, you know, with minority communities, it's always good to have somebody who's in the public eye to kind of speak up for those who are marginalized. So I think that would be an interesting thing to do, and maybe reach out to him. If anybody has any connections with the NBA. So with that, we have 2 minutes left, so I'll let you all go a little bit early, but on behalf of Ash and on behalf of our panelists, I want to thank you all so much for joining us today. As we said earlier, we're going to be sending you the slides. We're going to be sending you all the resources, the links, the videos, you know, any data sites that our panelists are able to come up with, and anything else that we think would be helpful for you. We'll be sending that to you via email. And this was live streamed on Ash's YouTube channel. So if you want to go check that out afterwards, you want to rewind something, go check it out, Ash.org USA on YouTube. And stay tuned for our first official episode for our podcast, Real Talk Tobacco. And then, of course, our new California-based hub on Ash's website is going to be coming soon. So stay tuned. Lots of exciting things coming up. And thank you so much again to Calvin and Narinder for being our panelists for today and sharing your wealth of knowledge with all of us. It was really, really wonderful to hear your thoughts and your expertise. And with that, we're going to sign off for today. Thank you all very much. We appreciate you being here. Take care.
Thank you.